By 1941, Germany had most of Europe figured out. France fell in 6 weeks, the British were stuck on their island, and things were looking pretty tidy. So, what's the next logical move when you're winning? Clearly, it's to attack your temporary best friend, the Soviet Union, a country so vast it makes the rest of Europe look like a suburban backyard. You know, the same country you signed a very public non-aggression pact with just 2 years earlier. The same one that's been dutifully sending you all the oil, grain, and rubber you need to keep your war machine running. Deciding to invade the USSR was less a strategic calculation and more of a geopolitical dare. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border, initiating the largest land invasion in human history. Because nothing demonstrates foresight like simultaneously fighting Great Britain and invading a nation with 11 time zones. The entire German plan was built on one tiny, completely reasonable assumption: that they would win in about 10 weeks. Before winter. Logistics, therefore, were treated as a minor detail. They planned for a short, victorious war, not a long, grinding one. For starters, Soviet railway tracks were a different gauge than German ones. Every mile of track had to be manually relayed. The roads were even better. Most of them weren't roads at all, just dirt tracks that existed in a state of theoretical passability. And the distances. My God, the distances. An army division in France might advance 20 miles from its supply depot. In Russia, that same division was suddenly 200 miles away. They literally couldn't carry enough fuel to get their trucks to the front and back. The German High Command's logistical charts must have been drawn in crayon. To justify this logistical optimism, German intelligence had to perform some impressive mental gymnastics. They estimated the Red Army had about 200 divisions. The actual number was closer to 360, with millions more in reserve. A minor discrepancy. They believed Soviet industry was primitive and would collapse after the first few hits. They seemed unaware of the massive industrial complexes being built east of the Ural Mountains, safely out of bomber range. Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff, famously wrote in his diary a few weeks into the campaign that the war had already been won. This wasn't just confidence, it was a profound, almost religious refusal to engage with reality. They thought the Soviet regime was so hated that the population would greet them as liberators. Instead, they got partisans everywhere. Their entire invasion was based on a caricature of the Soviet Union that they themselves had invented. The grand plan, Barbarossa, involved splitting the entire invasion force into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North was to take the Baltic states and Leningrad. Army Group South would grab the resource-rich Ukraine and aim for the Caucasus oil fields. And Army Group Center had the most glamorous job: drive straight for Moscow. It sounds organized, but the objectives were fundamentally at odds. The generals, like Heinz Guderian, wanted to knock out the political heart, Moscow. The German leader, however, was obsessed with the economic targets in the south. This created a strategic tug-of-war in the middle of the largest invasion ever attempted. Should the tanks go for the capital or for the oil? Do you aim for the head or the wallet? Instead of picking one, they sort of tried to do everything at once, ensuring none of it would be done properly. For the first few months, it looked like the optimists were right. The Wehrmacht moved with terrifying speed. They executed a series of gigantic encirclements, trapping entire Soviet armies. At Minsk, they bagged 300,000 prisoners. At Smolensk, another 300,000. The masterpiece was the Battle of Kiev in September, where they captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. It was, and still is, the largest encirclement in military history. The German newsreels were euphoric. The Red Army looked like it was disintegrating. There was just one tiny problem. While they were winning these stunning victories, the calendar pages were flipping. July became August. August became September. And the German soldiers were still wearing their summer uniforms. Because the plan, you'll remember, was to be done by autumn. The idea of needing winter coats was considered defeatist thinking. Before the snow came, the mud arrived. The Russians have a word for it, Rasputitsa. It means the time of no roads. In autumn, the seasonal rains turned the dirt tracks into impassable swamps of sucking mud that could swallow a truck whole. The German advance literally ground to a halt. Then came the cold. Not just a little chilly, but a truly profound Siberian cold. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. German antifreeze in their vehicles was only rated for -10. Engines cracked. The lubricating oil for their machine guns froze solid. The soldiers' bolt-action rifles had to be warmed over a fire to even function. Meanwhile, thousands of soldiers were getting frostbite because they lacked basics like gloves and proper boots. Invading Russia without preparing for winter is like picking a fight with a shark without preparing for water. The whole German strategy hinged on the Soviet Union being a house of cards. Give it a push, and the whole rotten structure would collapse. But the house refused to fall. In one of the most incredible logistical feats in history, the Soviets dismantled over 1,500 of their most important factories and moved them, by train, hundreds of miles east to the Ural Mountains, where they were reassembled and immediately began churning out tanks and planes. Stalin's regime, for all its monstrous brutality, proved incredibly resilient and capable of total mobilization. And far from welcoming the Germans, the civilian population, spurred by both patriotism and the invaders' own cruelty, formed massive partisan units. They blew up railway lines, ambushed supply columns, and tied down hundreds of thousands of German troops who were supposed to be at the front. The expected political collapse never happened. Instead, the invasion unified the country against a common enemy. German soldiers went into Russia believing they had the best tanks in the world. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs had crushed everything in Europe. Then they met the T-34. It was a complete shock. The T-34 had thick, sloped armor that made German anti-tank shells simply bounce off. Its wide tracks allowed it to glide over the mud and snow that bogged down the German panzers. And its 76mm gun could destroy a German tank from well outside the panzer's own effective range. The standard German 37mm anti-tank gun was nicknamed the Heeres Anklopfgerd, the Army's door knocker, because that's all it did to a T-34. Running into these tanks shattered German morale. They had invaded a country they thought was technologically backward, only to find the enemy had a weapon that was, in many ways, a generation ahead of their own. By August 1941, Army Group Center was within 200 miles of Moscow. The road seemed open. This was the moment the generals had been waiting for. And this was the moment the German leader decided to get clever. Against the frantic advice of his commanders, he ordered the main panzer forces of Army Group Center to turn south. Their new mission was to help Army Group South encircle that massive Soviet force around Kyiv. On paper, it was a success. They took over 500,000 prisoners. But it cost them 2 irreplaceable months. 2 months of good weather. By the time they finally turned their tanks back towards Moscow for Operation Typhoon in late September, the first snows were already falling. They had traded the single most important strategic objective, the capital, for a tactical victory that ultimately meant very little. It was like a football team breaking off a run to the end zone to go tackle a player on the sidelines. By early December, the exhausted, frozen spearheads of the German army could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They were spent. The German command was certain the Red Army had thrown its last reserves into the defense of the city. They were wrong. On December 5th, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov unleashed his counteroffensive. Where did he get the troops? From Siberia. Dozens of fresh, fully equipped divisions that had been waiting for this exact moment. These weren't exhausted conscripts. These were soldiers trained for winter warfare, equipped with white camouflage, reliable cold weather weapons, and T-34 tanks that actually started in the cold. They slammed into the frozen, overextended German lines and shattered them. For the first time in the war, the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht wasn't just stopped, it was thrown into a full-scale, panicked retreat. It's easy to be sarcastic about bad military planning, but the consequences were monstrously real. This wasn't just a strategic blunder, it was a humanitarian catastrophe built on arrogance. The Germans had no plan to feed the millions of Soviet prisoners they took. Of the 3.3 million captured in 1941, over 2 million were dead from starvation, disease, and exposure by the spring. It wasn't an accident, it was policy. The invasion was also designed as a war of annihilation. The infamous Einsatzgruppen followed the army, murdering civilians. Entire villages were burned. The logic of a quick, decisive war meant that any action, no matter how brutal, was justified if it brought victory closer. When that quick victory didn't happen, all that was left was the brutality. The scale of suffering directly caused by this one profoundly stupid decision is almost impossible to comprehend. So, let's recap. You launched the biggest invasion in history against a country that supplies your resources. You do it with a plan that ignores logistics, geography, and the climate. You completely misunderstand your enemy's strength, resilience, and technology. You set vague, contradictory goals and then change them halfway through. And you base the entire thing on the hope that you'll win before the first snowflake balls. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a military failure, it was a comprehensive failure of imagination. It was the moment the Third Reich, at the absolute peak of its power, signed its own death warrant. It would take 4 more years of brutal fighting, but the war was fundamentally lost here, in the mud and snow of 1941. It stands as perhaps history's greatest lesson that being powerful and being smart are 2 very different things. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!